There's a prison in Northern California built so remote, so silent, and so controlled that some inmates have spent decades without touching another human being. Inside its concrete security housing unit, gang leaders were buried alive in isolation, and a hunger strike shook the entire state. This is Pelican Bay. Before we step inside, subscribe now for real, fact-based prison documentaries that reveal what most people never see. Now, let's enter Pelican Bay State Prison. In 1989, California opened a prison unlike anything it had built before. Located near Crescent City, close to the Oregon border, Pelican Bay State Prison sits in one of the most isolated corners of the state. Surrounded by dense forest, cold Pacific air, and miles of distance from major cities, the prison was designed with one clear purpose: control the most violent inmates in California's correctional system. But Pelican Bay wasn't built simply to house violent offenders. It was built to dismantle power. During the 1970s and 1980s, California's prison system was overwhelmed by escalating gang violence. Groups such as the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and the Black Guerrilla Family had developed sophisticated command structures inside prisons. These organizations were issuing orders for assaults and murders both inside correctional facilities and on the streets. Prison officials faced a problem. Traditional maximum security housing wasn't stopping gang leadership from operating. Even when separated by yards or housing blocks, communication continued through coded messages, legal mail manipulation, and inmate networks. The solution, according to state officials at the time, was total isolation. Pelican Bay's most controversial feature became its security housing unit, known simply as the SHU. The SHU was engineered around a radical concept: long-term solitary confinement as a management strategy. Inmates identified as gang leaders or validated gang members could be placed in the SHU indefinitely, sometimes for years, even decades. Unlike general population units where inmates share cells or yards, the SHU at Pelican Bay was built around near-complete separation. Each cell measured roughly 8 by 10 feet. Concrete walls. A concrete bed slab. A small desk attached to the wall. A steel sink and toilet combination. The only window was frosted, allowing light but no view of the outside world. The design minimized human contact. Inmates typically spent 22 to 23 hours per day inside these cells. When released for exercise, they entered individual concrete yards, often described as small, empty enclosures with high walls and a patch of sky visible overhead. There were no group meals. No communal programs. No traditional yard interaction. Pelican Bay's SHU was considered by many to be one of the strictest isolation units in the country. California officials argued that isolating gang leaders disrupted communication networks and reduced violence statewide. And in some ways, violence inside general population units did decline over time. But the cost of that strategy would become a national debate. Placement into the SHU did not always require direct involvement in violence. Often, inmates were validated as gang members based on tattoos, possession of certain artwork, or statements from confidential informants. Critics argued that this system allowed indefinite isolation without a clear pathway back to general population. For inmates inside the SHU, time moved differently. Days blurred together under constant artificial lighting. Communication was limited to brief exchanges with correctional officers through steel doors. Legal visits were conducted behind glass. Phone access was rare. Mental health experts began raising concerns about prolonged solitary confinement. Studies linked extended isolation to anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and cognitive decline. Former inmates described experiencing sensory deprivation and emotional numbness. Yet from a security standpoint, Pelican Bay achieved what it was designed to do. Gang leaders who once coordinated violence across multiple institutions were cut off from traditional communication channels. The SHU became a symbol, both of strict control and extreme punishment. By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay's reputation had spread nationally. It was widely regarded as one of the toughest prisons in America. But behind the concrete walls, pressure was building. Inmates began challenging SHU placements through legal appeals. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits arguing that indefinite solitary confinement violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. And then, something unprecedented happened. In 2011, inmates at Pelican Bay launched a hunger strike. What began with a small group of prisoners refusing meals quickly spread across California's prison system. Thousands of inmates participated in solidarity. Their demands focused on reforming SHU policies, ending indefinite isolation based solely on gang affiliation and improving conditions. The hunger strike drew international attention. Media coverage expanded. Advocacy groups amplified inmate voices. The state of California faced mounting scrutiny. Some participants refused food for weeks. Medical staff monitored deteriorating health conditions. Negotiations between inmate representatives and prison officials began under intense public pressure. The hunger strikes would continue intermittently through 2013, becoming one of the largest prison protest movements in U.S. history. Ultimately, California agreed to significant reforms. The state implemented a step-down program, allowing inmates pathways out of the SHU without requiring them to debrief, a process where inmates provided information about gang activities in exchange for release from isolation. Policies regarding gang validation were revised. Many inmates who had spent decades in solitary were gradually transferred back to general population units. Pelican Bay did not close. The SHU did not disappear entirely, but its use shifted dramatically. Today, Pelican Bay State Prison still operates as a maximum security institution. However, reforms reduced the scale of long-term solitary confinement that once defined its identity. Yet the legacy remains. Pelican Bay became a case study in how far a prison system can go in pursuit of control. It revealed the tension between security and human rights. It exposed the psychological impact of isolation and forced California to reconsider policies that had operated largely out of public view. The prison's remote location, its concrete architecture, and its history of housing some of California's most violent gang members cemented its reputation. But Pelican Bay is more than a symbol of solitary confinement. It is a living institution shaped by decades of gang warfare, legal battles, reform efforts, and ongoing debates about punishment in America. To truly understand what makes Pelican Bay one of the most dangerous prisons in the country, we must go deeper, into daily life inside the SHU, into the gang hierarchies that once dominated California prisons, and into the psychological toll experienced by inmates who spent years inside concrete boxes. Because behind every steel door was a story. And many of those stories were never meant to leave the yard. The first thing inmates noticed about Pelican Bay's security housing unit was the quiet. Not the normal quiet of a rural prison surrounded by forest and ocean air, but the engineered quiet of a building designed to eliminate human interaction. When the SHU was built, architects focused on separation. Long, sterile corridors ran between rows of solid steel doors. Each door had a narrow rectangular window and a small slot for food trays and handcuffs. The walls were thick concrete. Sound did not travel easily. Voices were swallowed by structure. Inside each cell, space was measured precisely, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. The bed was a slab of concrete attached to the wall. A thin mattress rested on top. A small metal desk and stool were fixed in place. The sink and toilet were molded as a single steel unit. There were no bars, only solid steel and reinforced glass. The only natural light came from a frosted window, designed so inmates could not see the outside yard, the coastline, or even other buildings. They could see only brightness. For most SHU inmates during the height of Pelican Bay's isolation policy, daily life followed a rigid pattern. Lights turned on early. Breakfast arrived through the food port. The slot opened, the tray slid in, the slot closed. Direct physical contact was rare. Officers instructed inmates to back away from the door before it opened, hands visible at all times. Meals were eaten alone. After breakfast, time stretched. There were no group programs. No educational classes inside the SHU. No communal dining halls. No shared recreation. Some inmates received books through approved channels. Others spent hours writing letters or filing legal motions challenging their placement. For exercise, inmates were escorted individually to outdoor recreation enclosures. These yards were not open fields. They were concrete spaces roughly the size of a small room, surrounded by high walls and metal grating above. Inmates could see a patch of sky, sometimes feel coastal air, but they could not see another person directly. Recreation typically lasted about 90 minutes. Afterward, inmates were returned to their cells, handcuffed through the slot, escorted down the corridor, placed back inside, door sealed. Then more hours passed. Conversations between inmates occurred only by shouting through vents or tapping coded messages through walls. Some developed elaborate communication methods despite architectural barriers. But sustained interaction was nearly impossible. For inmates validated as gang members, SHU placement could last indefinitely. Before reforms, the primary pathway out of the SHU was debriefing. Debriefing required inmates to provide detailed information about gang activities, structures, and members. For some, debriefing posed a serious safety risk if they were ever returned to general population. For others, it meant betraying long-standing affiliations. Those who refused could remain in isolation for years. By the early 2000s, some inmates had spent more than a decade inside SHU cells. A few had spent over 20 years. Psychologists studying prolonged isolation warned of severe mental health consequences. Symptoms reported by inmates included insomnia, paranoia, depression, panic attacks, and hallucinations. Some described feeling emotionally numb. Others reported hypersensitivity to noise or difficulty concentrating. Correctional officials maintained that SHU inmates were among the most influential gang leaders in the system. Isolation, they argued, prevented these individuals from orchestrating violence statewide. And there was evidence that separating leadership disrupted certain communication chains. But critics argued that the policy often relied too heavily on gang validation criteria rather than proven violent conduct. Tattoos, possession of artwork associated with gang culture, or information from confidential informants could lead to placement. Over time, pressure mounted. Inmates began organizing legal challenges and hunger strikes. The 2011 hunger strike started at Pelican Bay's SHU. A small group of inmates refused meals in protest of indefinite isolation and other conditions. Their demands included eliminating long-term solitary confinement based solely on gang validation, improving access to programs, and revising debriefing requirements. The strike spread rapidly across California prisons. Thousands of inmates participated in solidarity. For weeks, medical staff monitored deteriorating health conditions. Some inmates lost significant weight. Public attention intensified. Media outlets covered the protests. Advocacy groups called for reform. In 2013, another massive hunger strike began, again involving thousands of inmates. The scale of participation was unprecedented in U.S. prison history. Under mounting pressure, California officials agreed to negotiate policy changes. The state introduced a step-down program designed to provide a structured pathway out of the SHU without mandatory debriefing. Gang validation criteria were revised. Many inmates were gradually transferred out of long-term isolation. In 2015, a federal court settlement in Ashker v. Governor of California effectively ended the practice of indefinite solitary confinement for gang affiliation alone. Thousands of inmates across California, including many from Pelican Bay, were released from the SHU and returned to general population units. The reforms marked a historic shift. Pelican Bay's SHU still exists, but its use has been significantly reduced compared to its peak years. Isolation is now more closely tied to specific disciplinary infractions rather than indefinite gang validation. Yet the psychological imprint of decades-long isolation remains part of Pelican Bay's legacy. Former SHU inmates have described the difficulty of readjusting to general population after years alone. Simple interactions, standing in line, eating with others, hearing constant conversation, could feel overwhelming after prolonged silence. Correctional staff also faced unique pressures working inside the SHU. Escort procedures were strict. Officers operated in an environment where inmates were considered high risk and influential. The emotional detachment required to function daily in such a controlled setting carried its own toll. Pelican Bay's SHU became one of the most studied isolation units in America. It forced policymakers, courts, and the public to confront uncomfortable questions. How long is too long to confine a person alone? Does isolation reduce violence, or simply contain it? Can a prison built to break gang power avoid breaking human psychology? By the time reforms took hold, Pelican Bay had already shaped national conversations about solitary confinement. But the SHU tells only part of the story. Beyond the isolation cells, Pelican Bay houses a broader maximum security population. Inmates convicted of violent crimes, gang-related offenses, and serious felonies across California. To understand why Pelican Bay earned its reputation as one of America's most dangerous prisons, we must examine the gang dynamics that made it necessary in the first place. Because before the SHU, California's prison system was fighting wars inside its walls. And Pelican Bay was built to win them. Long before Pelican Bay's security housing unit became a symbol of solitary confinement, California's prison system was already fighting a war. It was not a war fought with headlines or press conferences. It unfolded inside cell blocks in coded letters and through orders whispered across yards. It involved loyalty, racial divisions, and an underground power structure that extended beyond prison walls. To understand why Pelican Bay was built, you have to understand the gangs. By the 1960s and 1970s, California prisons were seeing the rise of tightly organized inmate groups. What began as self-protection alliances evolved into structured criminal organizations with leadership hierarchies, codes of conduct, and enforcement mechanisms. Among the most notorious was the Aryan Brotherhood. Formed in California prisons in the 1960s, the Aryan Brotherhood developed into a white supremacist gang with a reputation for extreme violence. Membership was selective, loyalty absolute. Initiation often required violence. The gang built a reputation for enforcing discipline through murder and assault, both inside prison and on the streets. By the 1980s, law enforcement agencies considered the Aryan Brotherhood one of the most dangerous prison gangs in America. Then there was the Mexican Mafia, also known as LAIM. Founded in the late 1950s in California prisons, the Mexican Mafia developed a structured leadership model. Its influence extended into Southern California street gangs. Orders issued from prison could trigger violence on the streets of Los Angeles and beyond. Unlike loosely affiliated neighborhood gangs, the Mexican Mafia operated as a governing body over many Hispanic street gangs. Loyalty to LAIM meant obedience, and disobedience often meant death. In Northern California, Nuestra Familia emerged as a rival to the Mexican Mafia. Tensions between Northern and Southern Hispanic gang factions created deep divisions inside California prisons. The Black Guerrilla family, founded in the 1960s, brought its own ideological framework. Originally rooted in political rhetoric, the group evolved into a prison-based organization involved in criminal enterprises and violent enforcement. By the 1980s, California prisons had effectively become battlegrounds for these organizations. Assaults were frequent. Stabbings were common. Retaliation cycles spread from yard to yard. Correctional officers faced rising danger. And perhaps most alarming, investigators discovered that gang leaders were issuing orders from behind bars that influenced criminal activity statewide. Isolation became the state's answer. Pelican Bay's SHU was designed specifically to neutralize this leadership. Inmates identified as gang leaders or shot callers were transferred to the SHU. The theory was simple: remove the command structure, disrupt communication, weaken the gang. But gangs adapted. Despite near total isolation, some inmates found ways to communicate. Messages were passed through legal mail. Codes were embedded in artwork. Intelligence officers spent years decoding letters and intercepting instructions. The battle between prison officials and gang leadership became a chess match. Investigators monitored tattoos, coded language, and associations. Inmates were validated as gang members based on evidence collected through surveillance, confidential informants, and possession of gang-related materials. Critics argued that validation standards were too broad. Officials argued that waiting for violent acts before intervening would cost lives. Pelican Bay became the front line in this struggle. In the early years of the SHU, violence inside general population units reportedly declined as key leaders were isolated. But critics noted that isolating individuals without fixed time limits created a different kind of crisis. Meanwhile, gang influence did not disappear entirely. Street gangs in California often maintained allegiance to prison-based organizations. Orders from inside could still shape street-level conflicts. Law enforcement agencies across the state coordinated with prison intelligence units to track emerging threats. One of the most significant federal prosecutions targeting prison gangs occurred in the early 2000s, when members of the Aryan Brotherhood were indicted under racketeering laws. Federal authorities alleged that imprisoned gang leaders were responsible for directing murders both inside and outside prison. Some of those indicted leaders were housed at Pelican Bay before being transferred to federal custody. The complexity of gang control inside prisons highlighted a broader reality. Incarceration alone does not dismantle organized crime. It relocates it. Pelican Bay's strategy of isolation was an attempt to sever the connection between incarcerated leadership and external operations. In some cases it succeeded. In others, gangs evolved, decentralizing command structures and relying more heavily on outside networks. Inside the prison walls, racial lines often hardened. In California prisons, housing and yard access have historically been influenced by racial dynamics tied to gang affiliation. Though official policies do not mandate racial segregation, informal divisions often mirrored gang alliances. Correctional officers had to navigate these divisions carefully. A miscalculation in housing assignments could trigger violence. Pelican Bay's reputation as one of the most dangerous prisons in America was rooted not only in its isolation units but in the volatile population it housed. Many inmates transferred there were serving life sentences for violent crimes. Some had histories of assaulting staff or other inmates. The combination of entrenched gang loyalty and long sentences created an environment where deterrence carried little weight. For inmates serving life without parole, the calculus of risk changes. If release is unlikely, the threat of additional time has limited leverage. Control must rely on containment and surveillance. That reality shaped Pelican Bay's identity. Yet over time the landscape shifted. Legal challenges and hunger strikes forced California to reconsider indefinite SHU placements. As thousands of inmates were released from long-term isolation following court rulings, the prison system had to integrate former SHU inmates back into general population units. Observers feared widespread violence. In many cases, large-scale violence did not materialize as predicted. Some experts argued that decades of isolation had weakened centralized gang control structures. Others suggested that inmates themselves were exhausted by years of conflict. Still, gang presence remains a factor within California's correctional system. Pelican Bay today operates differently than during the peak SHU era. But its legacy as the prison built to break gang leadership remains embedded in its history. The battle between prison officials and organized inmate groups was never simple. It was a contest of adaptation. Each new control measure prompted new counter-strategies. Each reform required recalibration. And at the center of it all were human beings, inmates bound by loyalty codes, officers enforcing strict protocols, policymakers balancing safety with constitutional rights. Pelican Bay became a symbol of how far a state is willing to go to regain control of its prisons. But gang wars and isolation policies are only part of the story. To understand why Pelican Bay remains one of America's most controversial correctional institutions, we must explore the legal battles, the reforms that reshaped its operations, and the question that still lingers. Did the prison built to break gangs ultimately change the system, or simply redefine the battlefield? Pelican Bay was built to stop a war. A war between gangs. A war between control and chaos. A war fought in concrete corridors where silence became a weapon. For years, its security housing unit represented the most extreme edge of isolation in America's prison system. Men spent decades alone in small concrete cells, cut off from human touch, cut off from time itself. The state said it was necessary. Critics said it went too far. Hunger strikes forced reform. Court rulings reshaped policy. Thousands left the SHU after years in isolation. And yet, Pelican Bay remains, still standing on California's northern edge, still housing some of the state's most serious offenders. The question it leaves behind is bigger than one prison. How far should a justice system go to maintain control? And when does security become something else entirely? If this documentary gave you insight into a world rarely seen, subscribe now for more real, fact-based prison investigations that go beyond headlines. Comment below. Do you believe long-term solitary confinement is necessary, or does it cross a line? Until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and remember, behind every concrete wall, there's a story the public rarely hears.